Now, let me take you into the beginning of everything. I first saw Daniel standing in his mother's driveway just after sunrise, rubbing his hands together like he wasn't sure whether to knock on my door or walk away. He was 32, polite in that quiet, steady way some people are, and he'd recently moved back home after years away for work. I had known him since he was little, but adulthood had carved new lines of responsibility and thoughtfulness into his face. He glanced up when he saw me loading groceries into my car. Morning light filtered through the trees, scattered across the hood, and settled on his expression, earnest, a little nervous, almost hopeful. He called up my name and asked, in that careful voice of his, if I might be heading toward the town center. His car was in the shop, and he didn't want to bother his mother, who was still asleep. Of course, I told him. It was on my way anyway. When he stepped into the passenger seat, he gave a grateful smile that softened something inside me, something I didn't even know had been tense. The air in the car felt warm from the early sun, carrying a faint scent of pine from the trees lining our street. As I pulled away, he let out a long breath, as if he'd been holding it for days. At first, we talked about simple things, the weather, his job search, my garden. But every time I glanced at him, just briefly between turns in the road, I saw something else sitting behind his eyes, a heaviness, a hesitation, a story waiting for permission. About 10 minutes into the drive, as we reached the open stretch of road past Miller's farm, he finally spoke up. His voice was low but steady, like he practiced the words. He said he'd been going through a difficult period and didn't know who to talk to. He didn't want to worry his mother, and most of his friends were scattered across the country. Then he paused, as though deciding whether he could trust me with the rest. I didn't push him. I just kept my eyes on the road and let the silence be comfortable, a kind of invitation. And slowly he began to share something deeply personal, something I hadn't expected from him at all. Not dramatic, not sensational, but honest in a way that felt almost vulnerable. He spoke about feeling lost after changing careers, about the quiet fear of letting people down, about the pressure he'd been carrying alone. The sincerity in his tone filled the car more than the morning light did. I listened, really listened, feeling a connection forming in the simple act of him letting me witness his thoughts. I told him that being unsure didn't make him weak, and that searching for direction at any age was more common than he realized. He nodded, looking out the window, but I could feel the relief in his posture. As if telling someone, just one person, lifted something from his shoulders. By the time we began approaching town, the tension in him had eased. He wasn't smiling exactly, but the lines around his mouth had softened. He thanked me, not just for the ride, but for hearing him without judgment. I didn't know it then, but that short drive would be the beginning of something unexpected, an emotional journey neither of us saw coming. After I dropped Daniel off in town that morning, I expected life to slip back into its usual rhythm. But the truth is, the conversation stayed with me. Not in a heavy way, more like a lingering warmth, the kind you feel after someone trusts you with a part of themselves. I kept replaying the moment he looked out the window, gathering the courage to speak honestly. There was something deeply human in that. 2 days later, I was returning home from the grocery store when I saw him again. He was standing beside his mother's mailbox, holding a small stack of letters, staring at them the way someone stares at a puzzle that just won't make sense. When he noticed me slowing the car, he gave a small wave. I rolled down the window and asked if everything was all right. He hesitated, then laughed softly, saying he felt silly. He'd received a letter about a job interview, a good one, better than the opportunities he'd been hoping for, but instead of excitement, he felt uncertain, almost intimidated. He didn't say exactly why, but I could tell he had more on his mind. I parked in my driveway and invited him to walk with me up the path. The afternoon light was warm, settling on the tops of the bushes and catching in the leaves that fluttered across the yard. He walked beside me, quiet at first, the mail still in his hands. Inside the porch, where the air smelled faintly of cedar and old books, he finally opened up. He said he hadn't expected our talk in the car to affect him as much as it had. It made him realize how long he'd been carrying his worries alone, how unusual it felt to speak honestly with someone who didn't rush to fix things or judge them. His voice was steadier this time, less burdened but still thoughtful. He told me he'd spent the past year trying to be everything at once, capable, successful, dependable, and somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten how to admit when something felt overwhelming. I told him that growing older didn't mean we stopped needing support. It just meant we learned to hide it better. He looked at me then with an expression I couldn't quite name, grateful perhaps, but also searching, as if trying to understand how I saw him so clearly. We talked for a while, sipping iced tea on the porch steps. I shared a few things from my own life, struggles I'd had when I was his age. Nothing dramatic, just honest moments that reminded him he wasn't alone. The conversation flowed naturally, like we were picking up a thread that had been waiting for both of us. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the yard, he stood and thanked me again. But this time the thanks felt different, deeper, as though the connection between us had started to grow roots. He said he didn't expect to find comfort in a neighbor, least of all someone who'd known him since he was a boy. I watched him walk back toward his mother's house, the letters in his hand, his steps more confident than they'd been earlier. Something told me this wasn't the end of our conversations, only the beginning of a path neither of us had seen coming. Before we continue, tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, and please remember to subscribe and like the video so you don't miss the final chapter of this story. Your support truly makes a difference. Now, let's continue. A few days passed before I saw Daniel again, though he'd been on my mind more than I cared to admit. There was something about the honesty of our last conversation that stayed with me, like a gentle echo I could still hear if I stopped and let the house grow quiet. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a sense that some small shift had begun between us. That Thursday evening, as the sky turned a soft, dusty blue, I was tending to the garden when I heard footsteps approaching along the sidewalk. I looked up and saw Daniel standing by the gate, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, expression thoughtful but lighter than before. He asked if I might have a minute. His voice wasn't tense, just careful, as though he didn't want to intrude. I wiped my hands on a towel and invited him in, and we walked through the garden toward the backyard patio. The air smelled of soil and fresh rosemary, and the last of the sunlight touched the tops of the plants in a warm glow. He sat down at the small table under the maple tree, and I could see he'd been working up to this visit. He told me he'd gone to the interview, and that it had gone better than expected, but afterward he'd felt strangely unsettled, as if parts of his life were shifting faster than he could prepare for. Then he paused and looked at me with a seriousness that made the moment feel heavier, though not uncomfortable. He said our talks had made him realize how much he'd been missing genuine connection, simple, steady, honest connection. He'd grown used to keeping everything on the surface, especially with people his own age who seemed to be rushing through life at full speed. He said being around me felt different, calmer, easier, like he could breathe. I wasn't sure how to respond at first. No one had said something like that to me in a long time, and certainly not someone his age. But there was nothing inappropriate in his words, only sincerity, the kind that makes you sit a little straighter because you feel seen without expecting it. I told him that I valued our conversations too, and that sometimes two people can understand each other simply because they meet at the right moment in their lives, not because of age or circumstance. He smiled at that, an unguarded smile, warm and a little surprised. Then he shared something more personal, something he said he hadn't even told his closest friends. He spoke about the pressure he'd put on himself since moving back home, how he wanted to rebuild his confidence but felt uncertain where to begin. He said talking to me gave him a sense of direction, or at least a sense of steadiness, that he'd been missing. The honesty of it filled the space between us, soft but unmistakable. I felt a quiet warmth in my chest, Not romantic, not dramatic, but deeply human. The kind of warmth that comes from realizing you're helping someone simply by being willing to listen. We talked for what felt like hours as the evening folded into night. The porch light cast a gentle glow over the patio, and the air carried the soft chirping of crickets. Daniel leaned back in his chair, shoulders no longer tense, and for the first time since he'd moved back home, he looked genuinely at ease. Before he left, he thanked me again, not just for the conversation, but for making him feel understood. He said he hoped we could talk again soon, only if I didn't mind. I assured him I didn't. As I watched him walk down the path toward his house, the night air cool around us, I felt a quiet shift inside me, subtle but unmistakable. Something was growing between us, not rushed, not confusing, just real. That weekend, the neighborhood was quiet in a way that made every sound feel amplified. The distant hum of a lawnmower, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional bark of a dog. I had spent the morning cleaning up the yard, letting my mind wander when I saw Daniel walking down the street again. This time, he was carrying a backpack, slung casually over one shoulder, and there was a certain ease in his step I hadn't seen before. He waved, and I invited him to ride with me again as I ran a few errands. He hesitated for only a moment before sliding into the passenger seat, and as I started the car, there was a comfortable silence between us, one that didn't need to be filled. The morning light spilled across the dashboard, warming the space in a way that made the car feel more like a small, shared world than a simple mode of transportation. As we drove, he spoke about little things at first: the bookstore he wanted to visit, a cafe he'd been curious about, a few neighborhood updates. But gradually, his tone shifted, softer now, thoughtful. He told me he had been reflecting on our conversations over the past week. He realized he had been isolating himself not out of fear, but out of habit, and admitting that to someone who truly listened had been strangely liberating. He spoke about wanting to embrace change without being afraid of failing, about the relief of feeling like he didn't have to carry every worry alone. There was a quiet humility in his voice that I found unexpectedly moving. I kept my eyes on the road, but I glanced at him now and then, noticing how much more relaxed he seemed, shoulders down, hands resting loosely in his lap. When we reached the cafe, we parked and stepped out into the crisp air. The street smelled faintly of fresh coffee and baked bread, and the sunlight glimmered off the windows of small shops. We walked inside, ordered tea, and found a quiet corner table. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by soft laughter and long pauses that didn't feel empty at all. He told me something I hadn't anticipated, that talking with me had made him more willing to open up to others in his life, to trust them with pieces of himself he had previously kept hidden. I told him I was glad, and that it was one of the most honest and human things we could do for each other: listen without judgment, share without fear. By the time we left the cafe, the afternoon sun had moved lower, casting long shadows across the street. Daniel thanked me again, this time not just for the ride or the conversation, but for the sense of calm and understanding I'd offered. I told him I'd enjoyed it just as much, and that sometimes the smallest gestures, like a shared ride or a quiet chat, can mean more than we imagine. As he walked back toward his house, I watched him pause at the gate and turn back for a wave. I realized then that something subtle but meaningful had changed between us. It wasn't about age or experience, or even proximity. It was about connection, the kind that comes when two people truly see each other, share a little of themselves, and leave with a sense of growth and reflection. I returned to my home that evening, the sky painted in soft pinks and purples, and felt a quiet satisfaction. That short drive, those honest conversations, and the trust he had shown me left me with a profound reminder. Connection doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it rides quietly beside you, in the passenger seat, in the comfort of shared words, in the gentle understanding of another human being. And that, I realized, was more than enough.